that we started with last week. If you remember, last week we finished our relapse prevention section and went over how a group should appear and the dynamics that are part of relapse prevention. And then we went into talking about trauma and trauma-based groups. And the one we're kind of looking at right now has to deal with trauma and HIV and going through the trauma process. So where we ended is we finished talking about the ACEs and the ACEs studies, and we found that as the ACEs scores increase, that the response to traumatic events has a larger impact on the individual than people with lower ACE scores. The next level, though, that we need to talk about is this thing we call resiliency, because there are situations in which a person would score fairly high on a measure of ACEs, but for some reason, trauma does not impact them as much as you would expect, even though they have pretty high ACEs scores. And we have found that there's this thing we call resiliency that really provides kind of an extra barrier, if you would say, between trauma and the individual and the individual's response. Okay, and that's kind of where we're heading with it today. And so we'll take a look at resiliency, and then we'll take a little look at the brain and the brain's response to trauma. And then I imagine that we'll be able to finish up this conversation this coming Wednesday, but we may need to extend it a little bit longer. I kind of want to hit a few other groups in our last week together. So I want to make sure we have sufficient time to talk about a few other types of groups and different facilitating skills that I want to make sure that everyone is aware of before we end our class, okay? So let's go to the PowerPoint that we were using last time. We'll talk about resiliency, okay? So the definition that SAMHSA gives to resiliency is the ability of an individual, family, or community to cope with adversity and trauma and adapt to challenges or changes. There's something that I really like about this very simple definition is that it mentions family and communities, because what we know is resiliency increases when resiliency is part of the family and the community and not just within the individual. In fact, we find that resiliency has very little impact when you don't have a strong family and community to support the individuals through trauma and traumatic events. So another way to look at this is resiliency is promoted in part by supportive relationships and social connectedness, as well as addressing sources of adversity. So when we're talking about resiliency, we also need to remember that as human beings, we are largely social beings. You know, our brain, it really surprises a lot of people when we actually look at the brain and the activity of the brain, because we would think that the majority of the brain is devoted to problem solving, to dealing with the complexities of life. But what we find is that the majority of the brain is actually dedicated towards social connection. In fact, when we ask people to stop thinking, the social networks in the brain start to activate, meaning that, and there's actually a term for it, it's called the default system. In that even when we're told not to think about thinking or just stop thinking, automatically the areas of our brain that process social information turns on automatically. And in some experiments, it may be 1 second. For example, in one research, they had individuals do math problems, and then they would say stop, and they would give anywhere from 1 second to 3 seconds, and then say continue. And even within that 1 to 3 second time, we actually saw the brain's mechanisms change to the areas that are associated with our social networking, our social identity, our social connectedness, and our social relationships. I bring this up only because it's really important to note that an individual can't operate in their own shell. We need other people, and that's the bottom line in this. And this is also why it's important to consider group work, because that's what we're trying to do when we're working with groups, is we're really trying to make it so that people capitalize on their social network system. So just some things to kind of keep in mind as we move through this section, and about where groups play a role in helping develop community and resiliency. Okay. All right. So just like the ACEs, there's a series of questions when we measure resiliency, and we'll go through these because these are all things, again, that you would discuss in a trauma group, to talk about where are you in your safety, where are you in being able to keep yourself safe, what are your social relationships. So these are also all things that we would really look at in the group setting. So the first three are just really kind of basic. Does the person believe their mother loved them when they were little? Their father loved them? Were there other people who helped mom and dad take care of you that also felt love? All right. So that's really the first three questions: is, was there adult figures that taught attachment and taught, the proper way of what love should look like? And so that's why the first three questions really just focus on that very basic questions. Are you loved? And were you loved as a child? The next four kind of deal with more of just life happening. So I've heard that when I was an infant, someone in my family enjoyed playing with me, playmates, cousins, those types of things. When I was a child, there were relatives in my family who made me feel better if I was sad or worried. When I was a child, neighbors or my friends' parents seemed to like me. So if you notice in the second set of questions, the second three, we're expanding the family from just the three units of mom, dad, and child to other family members and communities that are close to the child. And does that community reliably provide a sense of I'm liked, I'm worthy, and I'm happy? The third set of questions, again, expands now beyond the immediate community, beyond neighbors, beyond relatives. And now we're going to look at the broader community. So when I was a child, teachers, coaches, youth leaders, or ministers were willing to help me. Someone in my family cared about how I was doing in school, so something outside the family. My family's neighbors and friends talked often about making our lives better, meaning that there was a growth mindset within the family and community systems that says we can do better. And then the last few questions deal with type of rules and type of ways of development. And so we had rules in our house and we're expected to keep them. So that establishes boundaries, right? So whenever you have rules in a house and everyone is following it, it's established boundaries for you to feel safe to develop and grow in. When I felt bad, I could almost always find someone trusted to talk to. As a youth, people noticed that I was capable and could get things done. And so if we think about, on number 12, right, and we think about going back to developmental theory with Erik Erikson, right, during this time, they're going through the developmental range of industry versus inferiority, right? And this is kind of what this question is getting at, is do people beyond my family, especially peers, especially in this age group, that feel I'm capable and worthy? And think about how that is, how it goes in the brain. I know when I lecture on industry and inferiority in my other psychology classes, I always imagine it going something like this. Kid plays a guitar, mom and dad are at home saying, you're going to be a rock star, you're awesome. And so the kid's feeling pretty good about him or herself, and so goes to school, right, and drums on the guitar, and people are like, we can't wait to go to your concerts. Hey, I want to be a member of your band. What is that kid learning, or what is that individual learning, is that what he or she does has meaning and purpose, and it has purpose for other people. Now you take the other route, and kid strums on the guitar, and mom and dad say, you sound horrible, you should do something else. And so the kid maybe wants a different opinion, so he goes to school and strums on the guitar, and instantly, he gets made fun of, let's say, or he's bullied in some way. What is that individual learning? Is that what I do does not matter to other people, that what I even care about has no value to others. And so where is my value? All right. Now, if you think of that trajectory, and it's kind of a bipolar, we're probably all somewhere in between on the scale of complete industry versus complete inferiority. But what it tells us, if you think about the kid that is constantly experiencing more of the inferiority, more of the rejection, what they're learning is that they don't have value. And so that's going to put them at higher risk when it comes to traumatic events, because they're going to do thinking errors like, I must have deserved it, I must have earned what was coming to me. Number 13 is kind of an iffy question because it really is, it's one of those questions that we say has a cultural bias, where it says, I was independent and a go-getter. This would definitely be a good question for someone who was raised in the broader white Western culture, where independence is valued, a go-getter for individual value is valued. Where this question actually starts to run in trouble is when we start looking at other different type of communities other than the Western world. For example, looking at more towards collective type cultures where it's not about me, it's about what I bring to my family, what I bring to my community that provides me with worth. So I bring this up on number 13 because you'll probably be working with diverse groups, and this is not always a goal of someone's cultural upbringings or family upbringing. It may be honoring the family. It may be making the community proud of me by working hard or something like that. So 13 has a cultural bias on it, and I just wanted to bring that up, especially when we're not working with predominantly white Western cultures. And number 14, I believe life is what you make it. And again, this one is getting a little bit on the biased end as well, but it basically is getting you found a meaning in life. All right, so kind of what is the point of those questions? What is the point of it is we know that adverse childhood experiences influence health and social outcomes into adulthood. We know that adverse childhood, and going with this group that we're looking at, correlates with risk factors such as HIV, right? Resiliency factors can reduce the impact of trauma on a person's life. And that's really the take-home message of the resiliency. And it's something that you want to build in your group. So you want to build good, safe social connections where people can grow and develop, so that your your group is really kind of mimicking what your group members should be looking for outside that group setting, if that makes any sense. That's the type of environment they want to be in, even though it's a very difficult environment. And so those are all things to consider when looking at trauma-based groups, okay? Just really quick, does anybody have any questions before I move on?
With those thinking errors, could those be implemented on youth as well if their parents or if they're bullied and they're constantly told like, well, whose fault was it? Was it your fault because you did this wrong, or you did this, you did it this way, and that's the outcome. And so as they get older, they continue having that same thinking error. Is that how that works?
That's exactly how that works. So, and we can think of it both, when we look at bullying behavior, right, we can see this kind of go in a dual role where, someone is devalued to the point that they then start to take that devalued behavior out on other people to make themselves feel more valued and more worthy. On the other side of it, the person can be devalued to the point where they become what you would call the perfect victim, right? Where everything they do is wrong, so why try? And that creates a situation in which you get this bullying victimization mentality. The interesting thing is, and please don't get me wrong, this is not all victims and all bullies, but if you think about it, it all comes from the same pot, as you would say, is that being undervalued, not having authentic people in your life to be honest with you and to say, hey, you can work on these things, but you're great at this. We all need those kind of individuals in the room. Did I answer your question? I don't know if I did.
Yes, you did. It's just making me think, trying to look into that a little more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do know that currently, just going off on the bully end, I do know that a lot of trauma groups, especially with teens, use kind of this cognitive behavioral approach with trauma and what we're talking about, and talking about trauma instead of just the behaviors themselves that they're committing. So a lot of effective programs actually talk about trauma, not necessarily just the bullying behavior that they committed, if that makes sense. Okay.
So, are you saying most of the bullies or most of the people who, start bullying others have experienced some sort of trauma in their life, whether it be neglect, abuse, or something along those lines? Are those
a good number of them, but also a good number. So trauma could have definitely been part of their life, but also it may just simply be that they didn't build any of these resiliency factors that we've been talking about. So for a portion, and this isn't all, I want to make this clear, for a portion of the population, it is because of the trauma, it is because of those types of things that came up in life. On the other side of it, though, it may be that they just don't have those resiliency factors because they maybe had inconsistent parenting, maybe lived in a poor community, those types of things. Does that make sense? So yes and no, you got to take the resiliency factor into play as well.
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay, good. All right, Myra, the default process was interesting. It seems similar to dreaming to familiar people, but can also, yep, you're exactly right, Myra, on that comment. Very good comment. Those are, yeah, Rhonda, yeah, you're right on the right track. Yeah, Good comments. Thank you. All right, let's talk a little bit about trauma in the body and the brain. Just briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's good just to have that understanding as a facilitator. And sometimes people connect better when you use things like your brain does this. And so we'll go through this kind of quickly, but it is important just to have the knowledge base of it. So. We know that trauma at any age can affect the brain and result in changes of behaviors and responses to life experiences. And the example I brought up last week is kind of highlights this point is trauma and its effect on the brain and the effect on the individual is a subjective experience. As I mentioned last time, when I worked in a women's crisis shelter, I had a client who every time she broke a fingernail almost, it seemed like she went into a trauma response. Whereas in my example last week, there was someone who anyone would think would be going through major PTSD, and she kind of wasn't bothering her at all. All right. This is an important point to make. Trauma does not affect everyone the same, and I want you to keep that in mind. It also affects the brain a little bit different depending upon what type of trauma it is, if it's chronic, not chronic. And so as we're talking about this, kind of keep those continuums on your mind. So I wonder if this will play. All right, so I am going to go ahead and just play this quick video on toxic stress. Let me. So let's take a look at this real quick.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Forgot to hit unmute. Okay, so I'm going to go on. The thing that I wanted everyone to pay attention to in that video. Now I got to find it again. All right, there we go. It is the cortical response to trauma, and if it's not shut off. In this instance, you know, Okay, let's go back a little bit. In fact, no, trying to figure out how to explain this in a little bit more detail here. Okay, maybe this slide will help. Let's try it. Let's find out. So as the video stated, is that when the brain becomes overstressed, and this is an important point that should be made, is there's healthy stress for children, and then there's toxic stress for children. Healthy stress is when a child is put in a situation where they have to do some type of problem solving within some safe boundaries that the caretaker and the parents set up for them, or parents set up for them. That's an important part of development, is how to learn how to deal with adversity, how to deal with novel new situations. And that causes all healthy stress. In fact, it causes releases of cortisol, just like it does with toxic stress. And in that brief moment, that cortisol is actually helping the body system strengthen. The problem becomes is when cortisol and hormones related to the stress response stay in the system for extended periods of time. It starts to wear down the system. It's kind of, if you, the best analogy I think I've heard is chronic stress is like slowly draining the oil out of your car and leaving your car on. Eventually, even if all the oil isn't going to go, the engine is going to start to wear itself out, and there's going to start to become missing parts of the engine as it starts to freeze up because it no longer has oil. That's what extended periods of cortisol does to the body system. And as this slide says, is normal stress response, we all have a baseline, and after some type of threat is gone, we all return to that baseline. But as this suggests, ongoing threats is perceived. It can be perceived. The body doesn't return to baseline. It remains prepared for a threat, results in trauma response. I want to stop and focus on this slide because it's really important. Is stress responses can continue if the actual threat is no longer there. It just has to be perceived that that threat exists, and that will continue the cortisol and the stress response in the system, and it resets that baseline. All right. And in a lot of the work you'll do with trauma, people who are going through trauma, is really challenging those perceived threats, really helping the individual know if that's an actual threat, that's something that actually is still a potential continued trauma or potential threat, or is it something that doesn't exist, right? And a lot of the group work that you'll do will be working on those thoughts about that constant feeling that there is something there that is threatening. Okay. And as it mentioned, eventually, what happens is you have this long period where you have the perceived thoughts, and then you have the trauma, and you're having the trauma response, but the body system has set it so that even when the perceived threat goes away, the body is stuck on what we call the on position, meaning that the high arousal, hypervigilant, paranoid in a lot of ways. Those are some of the psychological aspects. We know that the cortisol levels don't go back down in the hormone system. And we know that the activation areas of the stress area in the brain can't slow themselves down after a period of time. And so even after if the person perceived the threat over an extended period of time and then no longer perceives it, they can still be stuck on this on position and still continue with the stress response. That eventually recent research has shown actually starts to have an effect on the immune system. It starts to tear down the proteins on the outer side of the cell and makes it so that the immune system itself isn't even as effective as it should be. All right, and this is kind of a graphical representation of what we've been talking about. So, whoops. Go back here. And so as you can see, so this is an example of a non-chronic type of situation where we have a traumatic event, right? And there's some places that a person can go, right? We hope that the normal curve would go somewhere along with this green line, if you see this. And eventually what we hope is that this will go back to the normal range. That's what we would expect the normal trajectory to be. In fact, In fact, if you notice on this normal curve, we have the stress response, and then we have an abatement of it. In fact, we go below the normal range almost to a parasympathetic response, but then we have an increase in trauma. And this is an important thing, especially if you're working with individuals who this is their first major trauma in their life, or maybe it's the one that really set off the symptoms of a trauma response, is that there will always be a rebound of the stress, all right? So once the person gets here, they're not out of the woods yet, because we know that they're going to have another trauma response shortly after. Part of it is biological, because your body has to reset itself. And since you went to a parasympathetic response along here, biologically, your body has to over exaggerate a little bit and before it can bring it back down to baseline. The other part of it has to deal with the brain itself. A lot of times when we go through a traumatic event, our brain will naturally block our access to those memories. And I think I mentioned this in this class before, that usually what happens is, I'll take an example. When I worked with sexual assault victims, I always took the date of their sexual assault and added 9 months. I'm going to put this line right here just as an illustration. Okay. The reason why I did that is because I always made sure that I checked in on that survivor now at the 9-month mark. Okay. And the reason being is that what I usually found is a person would have that initial trauma response. They would get out of the situations, their life would start to stabilize, they'll have this refractory period. And then somewhere around the 9-month mark, they're feeling safer in their world, they're feeling better. And that's where the brain goes, oh, okay, you can have these memories. And that's when you start to get a lot of flashbacks. You get a lot of night and day terrors. You start to get a lot of decompensating behaviors, such as increased risk of drinking or substance use, increased risk of sexual activity, increased risk of self-harm, and those types of things. So this is something to be aware of. And the reason why I want you to be aware of it as facilitators is this right here, to me, is the danger zone, because this is where your group members will start to say, you know, I really don't need to come. There's, you know, I think I'm doing okay. Everything's fine. And this is where you're at most risk of losing your participants within a group, is when they're going through this trough of a refractory period. So that's something to be aware of. This black line represents what someone who, as we mentioned before, probably has low resiliency factors. They're being put through chronic stresses. So you see this here. We have, you know, event 1, but then we have all these other events that are igniting a stress response. okay? And there's two potential things that can happen when this occurs. The system can get stuck on, meaning that you can no longer get rid of the cortisol levels. Your heart rate stays high. A lot of people in the stuck on phase often end up on blood pressure medication, those types of things. And this is kind of the symptoms of when you know someone is on the stuck on, is they have a lot of anxiety. They have panic episodes. They have what we call an exaggerated startle response. So one of the things that I would say is you're working with you're working with people with trauma, never approach them from the back and put your hand on their shoulder to say hi. That's just something that I've learned over the years. Hypervigilant, digestive problems. You can get a lot of hostility and rage. And there's this imbalance. You notice at the top of this list, it says hyperactivity, but then at the bottom of the list, it's sleepiness, okay? One, that just brings out the diversity of human behavior. Some people will be very hyperactive, others will be very sleepless, but we see an exaggerated combination no matter what. So if a person was traditionally always kind of a laid back person, you'll see a little bit more hyperactivity out of them. If you're working with someone who is usually very active, you'll notice that they may be taking naps now during the day, or going to bed much earlier, or complaining of exhaustion. All right. And hostility and rage. And I think this needs explored, because a lot of times people with trauma feel like that they have an anger problem, and that they blame it on the anger instead of this combination of their physiology not being able to re-regulate and not being able to effectively deal with the traumas that have happened to them. And so you'll get clients. I remember very well, going back to my domestic violence days, I was always asked if we would do a anger management course for survivors. And it was always an interesting conversation, because really those anger management tools don't necessarily address the symptom of being on the stuck on position. Okay. All right, so these people are in a constant sympathetic response. So they're that. When a person gets on the stuck off position, they're having a parasympathetic response, meaning that the body system is trying to slow down. It's trying to get to a very calm state. For people who are having a hard time managing their trauma, if they get on the stuck off position, stuck on off, okay, they feel depression, flat affect, lethargy, deadness, exhaustion, fatigue, low blood pressure, poor digestion. If you think about it, what's happening for this individual is the body's like, we're cool. We're done with having stress. We're not going to let the body get above into that zone again. And so we're going to keep everything in essence, the true meaning of depressed. The system stays depressed. Okay. So those are some things to think about when you're looking at your group members in a trauma group. Which one is each person? Are they all stuck on, stuck off? Who is? Because the conversation is going to be slightly different for both individuals. And so those are some things that you'll want to look at in your group, and you'll need to manage, because it's not a one point that needs to be made is this is not a one fits all model. Some people are stuck on, some people are stuck off. And it's something that you have to address on both ends. Because I will tell you, in my experience, in groups, if you don't manage it well as a facilitator, what you end up with is these people in the stuck on position start to think, well, maybe these people didn't have as enough trauma as we did. And they start feeling like maybe they don't belong there because their trauma isn't the same, those types of things. But what we want to do is find commonality, because what can potentially happen in any setting, and this is why it's important for your clients to understand each other, is these things can switch. A person who is on the stuck on position can go through a parasympathetic response for quite a while and be on that stuck off position. Okay, so that's just something to kind of keep in mind as you're working with groups. And I mentioned earlier that we know we've learned recently that chronic stress does have an effect on the immune system. It starts to tear down the proteins on the outer shell of the cells and really starts to make them less and less effective. Hence, we know stress is associated with mortality and mortality, and the other one. I can't remember the one where you're dying of a disease state, the other one you're dying of just aging. And we know that chronic stress can influence both and make both lower. We also know that there's changes that occur within the brain system. And a lot of the literature on this topic really focuses on children, because we know they have the most neuroplasticity, which is the ability for the brain to physically change in response to an environmental pressure. That's basically what neuroplasticity is. And we know as our brain ages, our neuroplasticity goes down. But when we're talking about neuroplasticity going down, it means that the brain is having a harder and harder time adapting to environmental contingencies. It doesn't mean that the brain isn't still being impacted and damaged due to stress as we age. And so I just want to make this point. When we're talking about neuroplasticity, we're talking about our ability for our brain to compensate for trauma that has happened. And we know that that's better in children than when we become adults. And as adults, our brain has less and less ability to adapt to especially newer and novel traumas, unless, again, we have that healthy background of a good family, good community, good that. And again, I'm going to bring this up. This does not apply to everybody. There are some people who came from horrible lives that are amazing, wonderful people. This is kind of just a generalization of individuals that come to a trauma-based type group, okay? All right, so just some summary points. Trauma affects a brain's development and changes behavior and responses to life experience. And I just want to bring this up again. We talked about that last time, about where people who go through some type of severe trauma, for example, an adolescent girl gets severely abused, they can stop at that developmental age for quite a while before they start to develop again. And so it's just an important point to make, that you may have individuals in your group that are 30, 40-year-olds, but their brains themselves might only be in the teens or lower 20s developmentally. And that's something to kind of keep in mind as you're working with these adults and trying to help them out in that context. Trauma triggers or reminders can result in the fight, flight, or freeze response. We saw that in the graphs earlier. And that's why, much like relapse prevention, you do spend a lot of time in trauma groups trying to help people identify their triggers, their thoughts, and their responses. And you go through those and you come up with themes, all those types of things that you would do in order to help them have a different response to that trigger. Many symptoms and behaviors are adaptations to traumatic experiences. And people can learn to better regulate their nervous systems with right strategies and support. And that's very important. I want to go back to many symptoms and behaviors are adaptations to traumatic experiences, mainly because there's quite a few disorders that really are, if you really look at them, are adaptive in nature, but have really negative consequences on their person, and they usually develop out of trauma. Okay, two really kind of severe examples is people who have dissociative disorder and people who have borderline personality disorder. With dissociative disorder, it is usually the individual, how do I put this? Well, let me back up. There are lots, and there's quite a few types of dissociative disorders. Usually dissociation is when, well, let me take a normal experience. I don't know if you guys have ever driven somewhere and you're so invested in some other thought or what you're going to be doing when you get there or something like that. You get there and you don't even remember driving there. You're kind of like, oh, how did I get here so quickly? Or oh, wow, I wonder how many lights I ran or something like that. I say that because I've experienced that. That's a form of disassociation. That's normal disassociation. When a person has been chronically traumatized over time, they can become what we call fully dissociative, that when they have a trigger happens to them, it's like the person that was there stops existing and this other person comes out and works through that trigger. The old name for dissociative disorder is multi-personality disorder. And this is where an individual's coping strategy is to develop different personalities from their main personality to deal with traumatic triggers that occur in their environment. Okay. And it's adaptive because it keeps the person safe. But if you look at it from kind of a want to get a person to experience life to the fullest without trauma, it can become very interrupting in the person's life, even though it's having, again, an adaptive purpose. Borderline personality disorder, as I've mentioned in this class before, is a disorder where there's chronic trauma within the family. And as a child, all of those family traumas and problems get swept under the rug and they're not talked about. And this develops a real mistrust for really humanity and for existence, to where the individual starts to have successes and then they get to a point where it can be success or it can be failure. And as a result, they spiral down and they start to decompensate because experiencing that success is scary. It's something that they're not used to. And what stress response tell us is we need to either fight, flight, or freeze. And so in those situations, they'll either start to fight, again, going into chaotic behaviors. Flight, they can take off. A person that I worked with who had borderline personality had the habit of just taking off for 2-3 weeks at a time. And she, the person would be found in the woods somewhere, all strung out. Okay. But those are all kind of, if you think about it, those are all adaptive responses to trauma, because what the body and the brain is trying to do is just protect the individual and protect them biologically. And if you think about those behaviors, even though they don't sound adaptive, that's where they grew out of, and they become non-adaptive as we have evolved and different type of stresses have been in our lives. Okay. People can learn to better regulate their nervous system with the right strategies and supports. And this is something that all of you, I hope someday, if you go into the trauma area, would be part of, is that we know that despite the changes in the nervous system that create a pattern response to a traumatic event, we know that through the right techniques, the right tools, that those things can be changed. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop right here real quick and see if anybody has Any questions?
I had a question. So whenever you showed that chart on a person being like stuck in that traumatic response or whatever, does like exercise help with that, or can it like bring them down, or does exercise not have anything to do with that, like as a coping technique?
That's actually a great question, Rose. And the answer to the question is it absolutely can help. Because when we exercise, it starts to this isn't the proper physiological response. This is just the best way I've heard it explained, is it starts to basically burn off all of that adrenaline and burns off a lot of the cortisol that's in the system. Now that's not the exact physiological mechanism, but I think that's the best way to explain it. So yes, you're absolutely right that exercise, but also on the other end, we know that meditative techniques also work. So did that answer your question, Rhonda?
Yeah, that helped. Thanks.
Any other questions before we move on here?
I was just wondering about the that same chart, and then I was kind of wondering about the question of like adolescence, because on the video it was showing like smaller children, and then it was talking about the development of brain and the trauma, and then on the overload of stress. So like when they get into adolescence, can that just be an overload of stress too?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, Anne, is so, you know, a young child goes through trauma and whatnot, correct? And then gets into adolescence. Is there kind of a reset on things? Is that kind of what you're asking, to where maybe there's what happens to the stress response when they become adolescents? Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm. Well, because in the beginning, how it was saying, like if there's a person there to encourage or to, like, you know, acknowledge when things are going good, but as you get older and then they have like the teenagers, you start to let them do their own. But it seems like they would need more time too. I mean, when they're smaller, yeah, you're there to encourage and stuff. But when they get older, it's more of a crucial time to be there to encourage. But yet at the same time, there's that like trying to let them go on their own. So like you couldn't be with them 24/7 like you would a younger child. Does that create a stress too? An overload of, could it be an overload of stress? Because if they want to be on the, like, make their own decisions, but at this start to go in that way, but then yet they still need a lot of guidance.
Yeah, and Leanne, I think what you're getting at is some good points that really can be made. Is what happens between childhood and adolescence is the significant source of support changes. All right. So when we're not in adolescence, it's really about the relationship between the child and the caregiver. That's really important. Yes, everyone else matters, don't get me wrong, but in those early adolescent years, early child years, if you remember reading those questions, right, it had to deal with, does mom and dad love me? Does my caretaker care for me? Does my, and it really focuses on those immediate individuals. When we go into adolescence, on the other hand, peer feedback tends to actually, I know this upsets a lot of parents, tends to be more important than parental feedback and parental guidance. That's not for everyone. There's lots of people with wonderful adolescent relationships with their parents, but for a good portion of adolescents, at least here in the United States, peer relationships become important. So one, if they have the same peers from childhood, then that's going to continue that stress and that that trauma response. And you're right, it will capitalize on itself. It will worsen, because not only do they not have that source of support from home, but now they're trying to look towards their peers for support, and it's just not just not happening, right? And so when we look at the transition from childhood into adolescence, the trauma we have to deal with can still be there, but the conversation has to change, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Leanne?
Yes, it does.
Okay, all right. And that's Myra. Does the time period of stuck on and stuck off give reasons to why the DSM-5? So Myra, that's actually a really good question as well, because really for depression, the reason why you have that waiting period, I think it's 3 to 6 months before you can be diagnosed, is because we want to know if it's a regular stress response, meaning that most people will go through bouts of depression. In fact, I would argue everyone in our life, everyone is not excluded from experiencing bouts of depression. And the reason why there's a waiting period for the diagnosis is we want to see, is the person having a trauma response? Is the person, is this a chronic issue that is going to require medical intervention? And the other part of it is if the person is having a healthy stress response, we know that they'll go through a bout of depression. And so do we really want to interrupt that process in a lot of ways, if that makes sense? And so that's kind of the waiting period. Right. Yeah, Rhonda, that's exactly right, is that it's not always about stress. It can be a myriad of different things. All right, more questions. All right. Okay. Okay. Let me look. I want to take a look at where we're at on our slides. Hold on just a sec. All right. I think, gang, we're going to need to start here, because this next section is going to be a little bit longer of a conversation than what we have time for, and I hate breaking topics up. So unless anyone has any questions or anything, let's wrap up for today, and then we'll continue this conversation on Wednesday. Okay, so everyone have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Take care.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.